The morning fog rolled thick across the ancient stones of Alnwick as Jakub Nowak stepped off the local bus, his worn leather bag slung over his shoulder. The Polish biologist's weathered face betrayed both exhaustion and excitement as he took in his first glimpse of the town that would become his home for the foreseeable future. The medieval castle loomed in the distance, its towers piercing through the mist like ancient sentinels. The invitation to study Cheviot Hills Nature Reserve had arrived unexpectedly 3 weeks ago, pulling him from his comfortable research position in Warsaw. The opportunity to study one of Britain's most preserved ecosystems was too tempting to refuse, especially given the unique species that supposedly dwelled within its boundaries. Yet something else had drawn him here, something in the way the letter had described the forest's unique character and unexplained phenomena. As he made his way through the cobblestone streets, Jakub noticed the curious glances from locals. Alnwick clearly wasn't used to newcomers, especially not ones carrying scientific equipment and speaking with an Eastern European accent. The town seemed frozen in time, with its stone buildings and traditional shops, a perfect gateway to the mysterious Cheviot Hills that rose in the distance like sleeping giants. "You must be Dr. Nowak," a voice called out, startling him from his observations. An elderly woman stood in the doorway of what appeared to be an antique bookshop. Her accent was unmistakably Polish, and her eyes held a knowing look that made Jakub pause. "I'm Zofia Kowalska. We've been expecting you." The way she said "we" made Jakub wonder who else knew of his arrival. He followed her into the shop, where the scent of old books and brewing tea created an atmosphere of aged wisdom. Zofia moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had lived in this town long enough to become part of its fabric. "You've chosen an interesting time to come to Cheviot Hills," she said, pouring tea into delicate cups that looked as old as the town itself. "The forest is restless lately, more so than usual." Jakub raised an eyebrow. "Restless? I'm not sure I understand." Zofia's expression became serious. "The old ones here speak of a guardian spirit, the grey wolf, not just any wolf, mind you, but a being that protects the forest from those who would harm it. When the forest faces danger, they say the grey wolf appears." Despite his scientific background, something in Zofia's tone made Jakub lean forward. She continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I've seen it myself, years ago. When you've lived here as long as I have, you learn that some things cannot be explained by your scientific methods alone." The conversation was interrupted by a sudden gust of wind that rattled the shop's windows. Outside, the fog had grown thicker, seeming to press against the glass like a living thing. Jakub felt a shiver run down his spine, though he couldn't explain why. "Your lodging is ready at the old gamekeeper's cottage," Zofia said, standing. "It's at the edge of the forest, where the old path begins. But before you go, take this." She handed him a small, worn book bound in faded leather. "It's a journal kept by the previous naturalist who studied these hills. He left rather abruptly." Jakub accepted the book, noting its well-worn pages and curious symbols etched into its spine. As he stepped back into the street, the fog swirled around his feet like a living thing, and for a moment he could have sworn he heard a distant howl carried on the wind. The walk to the gamekeeper's cottage took him along the edge of the forest, and with each step, Jakub felt increasingly aware of being watched. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers toward the path. What had started as a purely scientific expedition was already taking on a different character, one that made his rational mind uneasy. As he reached the cottage, the sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the landscape. The old structure stood solitary against the darkening sky, its windows reflecting the last light of day. Inside, Jakub found his equipment had already been delivered, but something else caught his eye. Fresh paw prints in the dust by the window, too large to belong to any ordinary wolf. Dawn broke over Cheviot Hills with an ethereal quality, the morning light filtering through a perpetual mist that clung to the ancient trees. Jakub sat at the cottage's wooden table, poring over the journal Zofia had given him. The previous naturalist's handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, filled with detailed sketches of unusual plant species and cryptic notes about watching eyes and guardian presence. The last entry, dated just 6 months ago, caught his attention. The forest knows. It always knows. The grey wolf is not what we think. It's so much more. They won't believe me, but I've seen how it protects this place. Science cannot explain everything I've witnessed here. Closing the journal, Jakub gathered his research equipment. His first day would be devoted to establishing study sites and documenting the baseline ecosystem health. Yet as he stepped outside, the forest seemed different from yesterday. More alive, more aware. The trees swayed despite the lack of wind, their leaves whispering secrets in an ancient language. His scientific training urged him to focus on the tangible, soil samples, plant specimens, wildlife tracking. But as he ventured deeper into the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being guided. Certain paths seemed to open before him, while others remained mysteriously blocked by fallen branches or sudden shifts in the undergrowth. Near an ancient oak tree, Jakub discovered his first anomaly, a cluster of flowers he'd never seen before, their petals an impossible shade of blue that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. As he knelt to take photographs and samples, a rustling in the nearby bushes made him freeze. The sound was too deliberate to be wind, too careful to be a small animal. "Hello!" he called out, his voice seeming to be absorbed by the dense foliage. The rustling stopped, but the silence that followed felt expectant, watching. When he turned back to the flowers, they had closed their petals, as if hiding their secrets from his scientific scrutiny. Later that afternoon, Jakub found himself in a clearing he hadn't noticed on any of his maps. Ancient stone markers formed a perfect circle, each covered in weathered carvings that matched some of the symbols from the journal. As he approached the center of the circle, his scientific instruments began behaving erratically, compass spinning wildly, electronic devices flickering on and off. A sudden crack of a branch made him turn sharply. At the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by shadows, stood a wolf. But not just any wolf. Its fur was a shade of grey that seemed to shift and change like storm clouds, and its eyes. Jakub felt his breath catch. Its eyes held an intelligence that was decidedly un-animal-like, piercing and ancient. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Jakub felt as if he were being evaluated, judged by criteria he couldn't understand. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the wolf turned and melted into the forest, leaving only a set of tracks that seemed to disappear mid-stride. Shaken, Jakub headed back to the cottage, his mind racing between rational explanations and the impossible evidence of his own eyes. As he approached his temporary home, he saw Zofia waiting on the porch, her expression knowing. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked as he approached. "The Guardian has chosen to show itself to you. That's significant." "I'm not sure what I saw," Jakub replied carefully, his scientific mind still struggling to process the events. "The wolf, it wasn't natural." Zofia nodded. "Nothing in Cheviot Hills is quite what it seems, Dr. Nowak. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you'll understand why you're really here." She reached into her bag and pulled out an old map, the edges frayed and yellow with age. "This belonged to my grandfather. He was one of the original guardians of this forest, back when people still remembered the old ways." The map showed Cheviot Hills, but not as it appeared on modern charts. Strange symbols marked certain locations, and handwritten notes in Polish described phenomena that defied scientific explanation. As Jakub studied it, he noticed that one of the symbols matched a birthmark on his own wrist, a mark he'd had since childhood. Zofia touched the symbol gently. "Perhaps it's not just chance that brought you here after all." The revelation about his birthmark kept Jakub awake most of the night. In the dim light of the cottage, he examined the old map Zofia had given him. Comparing locations with his modern geological survey charts, the similarities were undeniable, but the ancient map showed features that didn't exist on any current documentation: hidden valleys, underground streams, and curious spiral patterns marked with symbols he couldn't decipher. As morning approached, a memory surfaced from his childhood in Poland, his grandmother telling stories of their family's connection to an ancient order of forest guardians. He'd always dismissed them as fairy tales, but now, in the shadow of Cheviot Hills, those stories took on new meaning. She'd often traced his birthmark while speaking of destiny and responsibility, her eyes holding the same knowing look he'd seen in Zofia's. The early morning fog brought with it an unusual silence. Even the birds seemed hesitant to break the stillness. Jakub gathered his equipment, determined to investigate one of the spiral patterns marked on the old map. As he hiked deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural cathedral. He found the first spiral pattern carved into a massive boulder, partially hidden by moss and lichen. As he cleared away the growth, his fingers traced the familiar symbol, identical to his birthmark. The stone felt warm despite the cool morning air, and as he touched it, a surge of energy seemed to pulse through his body, bringing with it a flash of images: wolves running through moonlit forests, ancient ceremonies performed in stone circles, and a familiar pair of eyes watching from the shadows. The sound of branches breaking in the distance snapped him back to reality. Moving quietly, Jakub followed the noise, his scientific curiosity warring with an instinct that told him to remain hidden. Through the trees, he spotted two men setting up what appeared to be illegal hunting traps. Their equipment was sophisticated, designed to capture large predators alive, the kind of gear used by exotic animal traffickers. One of the men spoke in a hushed tone. "The grey one's been spotted again. Boss says it's worth 10 times what the others would bring. Some collector in Dubai's offering a fortune for it." Anger rose in Jakub's chest, accompanied by an unfamiliar sensation, a protective fury that seemed to resonate with the forest itself. The trees around him swayed without wind, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled. The sound was closer than he expected, and carried a note of warning that made the hunters freeze in their tracks. As Jakub watched, the fog began to thicken unnaturally, swirling around the hunters' feet. Their flashlights flickered and died, and shadows seemed to move with purpose between the trees. The men's confidence wavered, replaced by visible unease. They gathered their equipment quickly, leaving one trap behind in their haste to retreat. Once they were gone, Jakub emerged from his hiding place to disable the abandoned trap. As he worked, he noticed fresh wolf tracks in the soft earth, the same impossibly large prints he'd seen before. They formed a circle around the area, as if the guardian had been watching the hunters too. Returning to the cottage, Jakub found Zofia waiting with an ancient leather-bound book. "It's time you learned the truth about your family," she said, opening the book to reveal pages of handwritten Polish text. "Your grandmother wasn't just telling stories. She was preparing you for this moment." The book contained records of an ancient order dedicated to protecting sacred forests across Europe, generation after generation of guardians, working in harmony with creatures that straddled the line between physical and spiritual. As Jakub read, he discovered his own family name appearing throughout the text, accompanied by the same spiral symbol he bore on his wrist. "Your arrival here wasn't coincidence," Zofia explained, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "The forest has been calling its guardians home. The grey wolf appears only to those who carry the old blood, those capable of understanding and protecting the balance." A distant howl echoed through the valley, closer than ever before. Jakub felt it resonate with something deep within him, awakening memories and instincts he hadn't known he possessed. The forest was no longer just a research site. It was calling to him, drawing him deeper into its mysteries, and he knew his real work in Cheviot Hills was just beginning. The following days brought subtle but undeniable changes to Jakub's perception of Cheviot Hills. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds carried deeper meaning, and he found himself understanding the forest's rhythms in ways his scientific training couldn't explain. The old book Zofia had shared revealed that such heightened awareness was common among those of guardian bloodlines, a reawakening of dormant abilities passed down through generations. During his morning surveys, Jakub discovered he could sense disturbances in the forest's energy. Areas where the hunters had passed felt wounded, leaving invisible scars that made his birthmark tingle uncomfortably. He began mapping these disturbances, creating a network of locations where the forest's protective boundaries felt weakest. One particular morning, while documenting a rare species of moss that seemed to glow with its own inner light, Jakub heard a sound that made his blood freeze, the pained whimper of a trapped animal. Following the sound, he found a magnificent female wolf caught in one of the hunter's sophisticated traps. Her fur was a familiar shifting grey, though not quite as ethereal as the guardian he'd encountered before. The wolf's eyes met his, filled with intelligence and pain. Around her neck was a leather collar with strange symbols that matched those in his grandmother's stories. This was no ordinary wolf. She was one of the forest's protected creatures, possibly a physical manifestation of its power. As Jakub approached carefully, he noticed signs that she had recently given birth. "I'm here to help," he whispered in Polish, the words feeling ancient and powerful on his tongue. The wolf's eyes seemed to understand, and she remained still as he examined the trap. Years of wildlife research had taught him how to handle such mechanisms. But this one was different, more complex and clearly designed to hold supernatural beings. As he worked to free her, Jakub felt a presence watching from the shadows. The guardian was there, observing, testing. The air grew thick with energy, and the symbols on his map began to glow faintly through his backpack. When the trap finally released, the female wolf limped a few steps before turning to face him. She pressed her muzzle briefly against his birthmark before disappearing into the undergrowth. The encounter left Jakub shaken, but more certain than ever of his purpose here. Returning to the cottage, he found new markings had appeared on Zofia's map overnight, pathways and safe havens he somehow knew would lead him to the wolf's cubs. The forest was communicating with him, showing him what needed to be protected. "The forest's magic grows stronger," Zofia observed, watching him study the map. "But so do the forces that threaten it. The hunters you saw aren't working alone. They serve those who would exploit this place's power, strip it of its ancient guardians for profit and control." She pressed a worn silver pendant into his hand, its surface etched with the spiral symbol of his birthmark. "This belonged to your grandmother. She left it in my care years ago, saying it would be needed when the time came. Wear it. It will help you see what others cannot." As Jakub slipped the pendant around his neck, the cottage's shadows deepened, and for a moment he glimpsed other figures in the room, transparent shapes of past guardians watching with approval. The pendant felt warm against his chest, pulsing in rhythm with the forest's heartbeat. That night, under a moon that seemed impossibly close, Jakub ventured back into the forest. The pendant guided him, growing warmer as he approached places of power and cooling when danger lurked nearby. He found himself moving with newfound stealth, his footsteps naturally avoiding dry twigs and crunching leaves. In a hidden hollow, he discovered fresh evidence of the hunters' activities, sophisticated surveillance equipment watching the paths where the grey wolves had been spotted. But now he could see what the hunters couldn't, the subtle ways the forest diverted its creatures around these areas, using ancient magic to protect its own. Standing in that hollow under the moonlight, Jakub felt the full weight of his heritage and responsibility settling onto his shoulders. The scientific papers and environmental studies he'd planned to write seemed trivial now compared to the real work before him, becoming a true guardian of Cheviot Hills, bridging the world of science and ancient magic to protect something precious and irreplaceable. The silver pendant became Jakub's constant companion, its power growing stronger with each passing day. He learned to interpret its subtle vibrations, a warm pulse for ancient magic, a cold tremor for approaching danger, and a curious resonance when the guardian was near. His scientific mind still struggled to rationalize these experiences, but he could no longer deny the reality of what was happening. During his dawn patrol of the forest's boundaries, Jakub discovered something extraordinary. The glowing moss he'd documented earlier had spread, forming luminescent patterns that matched the spiral symbols from his grandmother's stories. As he knelt to examine it, the pendant grew warm, and suddenly he could see energy flowing through the forest floor like countless ribbons of light, ley lines, as the old book had called them, channels of ancient power that fed the forest's magic. "Your awareness grows stronger," a voice said behind him. Zofia stood there, looking different somehow, more ethereal, her eyes reflecting centuries of wisdom. But time grows short. The hunters have discovered one of the wolf cubs' sanctuaries. Jakub's heart raced. "How do you know?" "The trees speak to those who listen," she replied, touching a nearby trunk. "They've been watching, as they always have. The grey wolves are not just animals, Jakub. They are the physical embodiment of the forest's guardian spirit, split into multiple forms. Each cub carries a fragment of the original guardian's power." The pendant pulsed urgently, and Jakub felt a tugging sensation, pulling him deeper into the forest. Following this new instinct, he moved with supernatural silence, his feet finding safe passages through the underbrush. The forest seemed to part before him, branches moving aside to clear his path. In a secluded clearing, he found fresh evidence of the hunter's presence: broken branches, disturbed earth, and something that made his blood boil. Traces of sedative darts designed to capture large predators. But there was something else, something only his awakened senses could detect. The air shimmered with recent magic, and paw prints in the soil glowed faintly with residual power. Placing his hand on the ground, Jakub closed his eyes and concentrated as the book had instructed. Images flooded his mind. The female wolf he'd rescued, leading her cubs through secret paths beneath the ancient trees, using old magic to hide their trail. They were safe, for now, but the hunters had come terrifyingly close. A sudden rustle made him spin around. Through the trees, he glimpsed the guardian, the magnificent grey wolf with eyes that held centuries of knowledge. This time, instead of disappearing, it held his gaze and projected a series of images directly into his mind. A network of underground caves, a moonlit ceremony at the stone circle, and a pressing sense of urgency. "Show me," Jakub whispered, and the guardian turned, leading him deeper into the forest than he'd ever ventured before. They arrived at an ancient oak tree, its trunk wider than any he'd seen in Cheviot Hills. The pendant burned hot against his chest as the guardian touched its nose to the tree's bark, revealing a shimmering doorway in the air beside it. Stepping through felt like passing through a veil of cool water. Inside, Jakub found himself in a vast cave system, its walls covered in luminescent symbols that matched his birthmark. Here, the forest's magic was so thick he could almost taste it, sweet and ancient, like honey made from flowers that bloomed thousands of years ago. The guardian led him to a central chamber where the female wolf rested with her cubs. 3 tiny bundles of shifting grey fur, each bearing a faint spiral mark on their fur. As Jakub approached, the cubs raised their heads, their eyes glowing with the same ancient intelligence as their parents. "They're the future of this place," Zofia's voice echoed as she emerged from another passage. "If the hunters capture even one, the forest's protective magic will be weakened. The balance must be maintained, Jakub. Your grandmother understood this. It's why she prepared you, even from childhood." The guardian approached Jakub, pressing its forehead against his birthmark. A surge of power flowed between them, and suddenly the forest's song became clear. A symphony of ancient magic, natural forces, and living beings, all connected in ways his scientific training had never imagined. He was no longer just an observer or protector, he was becoming part of the forest itself. Dawn painted the sky in shades of amber, and rose as Jakub emerged from the cave system, his mind still processing the profound connection he'd experienced with the Guardian. The forest felt different now, not just alive, but an extension of his own consciousness. Every rustle of leaves carried meaning, every shadow held purpose, and the very air thrummed with ancient songs only he could hear. The pendant at his chest suddenly turned ice-cold, its warning unmistakable. Through his enhanced senses, Jakub detected multiple presences moving through the forest. The hunters had returned, and they weren't alone. Their equipment hummed with electronic frequencies that created discordant ripples in the forest's natural energy field. Using his newfound abilities, Jakub merged with the shadows of the ancient trees, moving as silently as the Guardian itself. He counted 4 hunters, their movements precise and coordinated, suggesting professional training. They carried sophisticated tracking equipment and weapons that made his pendant pulse with warning, devices designed to detect and neutralize supernatural entities. "The energy readings are off the charts here," one hunter whispered into a radio. But the client was right. These wolves aren't natural. If we can capture one of the cubs, the testing alone would be worth millions. Anger flared in Jakub's chest, but with it came something else, a surge of protective power that made the spiral birthmark on his wrist glow faintly. The forest responded to his emotion, branches shifting subtly to obscure paths, shadows deepening to hide sensitive areas. He wasn't just working with nature, he was becoming a conductor of its ancient symphony. Zofia's voice echoed in his memory. The forest's power flows through the bloodlines of its guardians. In times of need, those with the old blood can call upon abilities that bridge the gap between the physical and spiritual worlds. Drawing upon this knowledge, Jakub pressed his hand against a massive oak tree, closing his eyes to concentrate. Through the root network, he could sense everything, the location of each hunter, the safe hiding place where the wolf cubs rested, and the approaching presence of something ancient and powerful. The Guardian was moving too, orchestrating a complex dance of protection and deception. The hunters split into pairs, following different energy signatures. Jakub tracked them through his connection with the forest, watching as they drew closer to several false trails the Guardian had created. But one pair of hunters was different. They carried a device that seemed to cut through the forest's magical defenses, following the true energy signature of the cubs. Making a quick decision, Jakub removed the silver pendant and hung it on a branch where moonlight caught it, creating patterns of light that danced through the forest. The hunters, trained to spot unusual phenomena, immediately moved toward it. As they approached, Jakub channeled his energy through the pendant, creating an illusion of wolf cubs moving through the underbrush. The forest responded to his improvised plan, the ancient magic amplifying his efforts. Bioluminescent moss began to glow in strategic patterns, leading the hunters away from the real cubs. Wind whispered through the trees in ways that mimicked wolf calls, drawing them further from their target. But the other pair of hunters remained dangerously close to discovering the cave entrance. Jakub felt a sudden surge of power. The Guardian was offering him access to more ancient magic. Without hesitation, he accepted, and knowledge flooded his consciousness. His birthmark burned with blue fire that cast no heat, and the forest's full power coursed through him, moving with supernatural grace. Jakub began a complex series of gestures his grandmother had once shown him in childhood, games that he now recognized as training. The forest responded dramatically. Fog rose from the ground, taking the shape of running wolves that darted between the trees. The hunters and equipment sparked and malfunctioned, their compasses spinning wildly. In the confusion, Jakub glimpsed movement near the cave. Zofia was there, her form seeming to shift between human and something else as she guided the female wolf and her cubs through a hidden passage to safety. The Guardian appeared beside them, its presence creating a barrier of pure energy that shielded them from detection. The hunters' confidence wavered as their equipment failed and the forest itself seemed to turn against them. Shadows moved independently of light, trees creaked and swayed without wind, and everywhere they looked, gleaming eyes seemed to watch from the darkness. The very ground beneath their feet pulsed with warning energy, and their instincts screamed of ancient power awakened. The forest thrummed with ancient power as Jakub maintained the protective illusions, his scientific mind now working in perfect harmony with his awakened abilities. Through his connection with the trees, he sensed the hunters regrouping, pulling out backup equipment that worried him even more than their original gear. These new devices emitted a frequency that seemed to disrupt the forest's natural energy field. The client said to expect resistance. The lead hunter's voice crackled through their radio. Activate the dampening field. Whatever's causing these phenomena, it can't maintain its energy pattern if we disrupt the local electromagnetic field. Jakub felt the effect immediately. It was like a thick blanket being thrown over the forest's song, muffling the ancient magic he'd come to rely on. The glowing moss dimmed, the fog figures began to dissipate, and his connection to the root network weakened. His birthmark burned with a dull ache, struggling against the artificial suppression. But years of scientific training hadn't been wasted. Understanding the principles behind their technology, Jakub realized they were using a type of electromagnetic interference to disrupt the natural energy patterns. The forest's magic, he now understood, operated on frequencies that science was only beginning to detect. Zofia appeared beside him, her form flickering like a candle in wind. "They seek to silence the forest's voice," she whispered, her own power clearly affected by the dampening field. "But they forget. The oldest magic comes from the earth itself. Your grandmother knew this. Remember her lessons about the stone circles?" The memory clicked into place, his grandmother teaching him about ancient sites built on natural power points, places where the earth's energy naturally concentrated. The stone circle he'd discovered earlier wasn't just a historical artifact, it was a focal point for the forest's power, an amplifier for its natural energy. Moving swiftly through the darkening woods, Jakub made his way to the stone circle, the pendant growing warmer as he approached. The guardian materialized beside him, its form more solid here where the earth's natural power was strongest. Together, they reached the center of the circle just as the hunter's dampening field reached full strength. The scientific equipment the hunters carried began to react strongly to the stone circle's presence. Their readings went haywire, unable to process the concentration of natural energy. Jakub placed his hand on the central standing stone, feeling the raw power that flowed up from deep within the earth. Power that existed long before human technology, power that no artificial field could fully suppress. Drawing upon both his scientific knowledge and newfound magical abilities, Jakub began to understand how the two forces could work together. The stones weren't just conductors of magical energy, they were natural amplifiers of the Earth's electromagnetic field. By channeling the ancient power through the stone circle's geometric pattern, he could create a counter-frequency to the hunter's dampening field. The guardian seemed to understand his realization. It moved to each stone in turn, touching them with its nose, awakening dormant energy that had laid waiting for centuries. The spiral marking on Jakub's wrist began to glow with renewed intensity, no longer fighting against the dampening field, but working with the Earth's natural resonance. Zofia's voice carried on the wind. "The old ways and the new can work together. Jakub, your grandmother understood this. It's why she encouraged your scientific studies even while teaching you the ancient knowledge. The forest doesn't reject science. It embraces all forms of understanding." As if in response to her words, the stone circle began to pulse with visible energy. The hunter's dampening field flickered and warped, unable to maintain its artificial frequency against the pure natural power flowing through the ancient stones. Their equipment began to short out, overwhelmed by the combination of scientific precision and primal force. Through his connection with the forest, Jakub felt the female wolf and her cubs reaching their new sanctuary, a hidden valley protected by layers of natural power too deep for any human technology to detect. The guardian's presence grew stronger, its form solidifying as the balance of power shifted back to the forest's favor. The hunters found themselves surrounded by a display of natural power beyond their experience, stones humming with visible energy, the ground itself pulsing with light that followed the ley lines, and everywhere they looked, the eyes of the forest, watching with ancient intelligence. Their technology, meant to suppress the supernatural, instead revealed the full magnitude of what they faced. The aftermath of the confrontation at the stone circle left the forest transformed. The ancient stones still hummed with awakened power, creating a visible network of energy that connected the sacred sites throughout Cheviot Hills. Jakub stood in the center of this web of light, his scientific mind cataloging the phenomena while his awakened senses interpreted their deeper meaning. The hunters had retreated, their equipment rendered useless by the surge of natural power. But more importantly, the forest had revealed a truth that bridged the gap between science and ancient magic. The pendant around Jakub's neck no longer felt like a separate source of power. It had become a conduit, connecting his scientific understanding with the old ways. "Your grandmother would be proud," Zofia said, emerging from the shadows. Her form seemed more stable now, drawing strength from the awakened ley lines. She always said the true guardian would be one who could unite both worlds, the measurable and the mystical. The guardian appeared, leading them to a previously hidden chamber beneath the stone circle. As they descended, Jakub's enhanced vision revealed ancient cave paintings that told the story of the forest's protectors. But these weren't just artistic representations. They were scientific records, documenting the relationship between the Earth's natural energy fields and the forest's magical properties. "Your scientific papers weren't wrong," Zofia explained, touching one of the paintings. "They were just incomplete. The data you collected about the forest's unusual electromagnetic patterns. That was the first step toward understanding what the ancients already knew. The forest's magic isn't supernatural. It's the highest form of nature itself." The guardian led them deeper into the chamber, where crystalline formations caught and amplified the natural light. Here, Jakub could see the full scope of what he'd been studying. The rare species he'd documented weren't just evolutionary anomalies. They were physical manifestations of the forest's conscious adaptation, creating guardians in many forms. The female wolf and her cubs had found sanctuary here, nestled among crystals that resonated with the same frequency as their own energy signatures. The cubs' eyes glowed with understanding beyond their age, their forms occasionally shifting between physical and something more ethereal. They weren't just wolves, they were the forest's way of ensuring its wisdom and power would continue. Jakub's birthmark tingled as he approached them, responding to their energy. Through their connection, he received a series of visions, generations of guardians working in harmony with the forest, using both scientific knowledge and ancient wisdom to protect this sacred place. He saw his grandmother among them, young and strong, wielding both laboratory equipment and magical artifacts with equal skill. "The forest chose you long ago," Zofia said, watching the interaction. "Your scientific career wasn't a departure from your destiny. It was preparation for it. The forest needs guardians who can understand its mysteries in all forms, who can protect it in an age where the threats come with both physical and technological weapons." The guardian approached Jakub, pressing its forehead against his birthmark once again. This time, the connection felt different, a complete merger of his scientific knowledge and magical awareness. He understood now that the forest's power wasn't just mystical energy. It was the most advanced form of natural technology, operating on principles that modern science was only beginning to grasp. Through this new understanding, Jakub began to see patterns in the forest's behavior that his scientific training had missed. The unusual electromagnetic readings, the rare species combinations, the mysterious weather patterns, all were part of an intricate defense system that had evolved over millennia. The forest wasn't just a collection of trees and animals. It was a living laboratory of natural innovation. The cubs approached him, their small forms glowing with inherited power. As they touched his hands with their noses, Jakub felt the forest's knowledge flow through him more clearly than ever. He saw how each species, each plant, each stone played its part in maintaining the balance. The scientific papers he'd planned to write would need serious revision, not to obscure the truth, but to help others understand it in its full complexity. The days following the confrontation brought profound changes to Cheviot Hills. The awakened power of the stone circle had created a permanent shift in the forest's energy field, making the boundary between natural and supernatural more permeable. For Jakub, this meant learning to navigate both realms with increasing skill, documenting the changes with both scientific instruments and magical awareness. In the cottage, he'd set up an unusual laboratory where modern equipment sat alongside ancient artifacts. His research notes now included both detailed scientific observations and symbols that glowed with their own inner light. The pendant had become more than a tool. It was now a bridge between methodologies, helping him translate magical phenomena into scientific terms. "Your grandmother's research journals might interest you now," Zofia said one morning, placing a stack of worn notebooks on his desk. She found ways to measure the unmeasurable, to quantify what science called impossible. But she kept these records hidden, knowing the world wasn't ready for such knowledge. The journals revealed decades of careful documentation, electromagnetic frequency patterns that matched ancient ritual sites, chemical analyses of plants that showed impossible properties, and detailed studies of the grey wolf's energy signature. His grandmother had been conducting double research all along, maintaining her public scientific career while secretly documenting the forest's true nature. The female wolf and her cubs had become regular visitors to the cottage, their presence strengthening the protective barriers around Cheviot Hills. Through their connection, Jakub learned to see the forest as they did, a complex network of energy and information that functioned like a living computer, processing and responding to threats in real time. Using his enhanced understanding, he began developing new conservation strategies that incorporated both scientific principles and ancient protection methods. The forest's natural defenses could be amplified through careful management of its ecosystem, creating sanctuaries that were both physically and mystically secure. "The hunters won't be the last threat," Zofia warned, watching him work, "but you've given the forest something it hasn't had in generations. A guardian who can defend it in both realms. Your research can help protect other sacred places too, once it's properly understood." The guardian appeared during these conversations more frequently now, its form shifting between wolf and pure energy. Through their strengthened bond, Jakub understood that his role was evolving beyond simple protection. He was becoming a teacher, preparing to share his knowledge with others who might have the potential to bridge the two worlds. His scientific papers were taking shape, carefully written to present his findings in terms the academic world could accept while containing deeper truths for those with the wisdom to recognize them. The spiral symbol on his wrist had become a key to understanding. Those who bore similar marks would see beyond the surface of his research to the ancient knowledge beneath. The cubs grew stronger each day, their developing powers harmonizing with the forest's enhanced energy field. They represented a new generation of guardians, born into a world where science and magic were beginning to reconnect. Through them, Jakub saw the future of Cheviot Hills, a place where ancient wisdom and modern knowledge worked in concert to protect something precious. Working with Zofia, he began documenting the old traditions in new ways, creating a database that linked scientific observations with magical phenomena. Each entry was carefully coded, accessible at different levels depending on the reader's ability to perceive the deeper truths. It would become a guide for future guardians, helping them understand their dual heritage. The forest itself seemed to approve of these efforts, responding with increased vitality. New species appeared in protected areas, bearing subtle marks of magical influence. The ley lines grew stronger, their energy patterns becoming stable enough to register on scientific instruments. Cheviot Hills was evolving, becoming a model for how ancient places could survive and thrive in the modern world. Late one evening, as Jakub reviewed his grandmother's journals, he found a letter addressed to him, written years before his arrival. "My dear grandson," it read, "if you're reading this, you've found your true path. The forest chose you because you could question everything while believing in something greater than yourself. Your scientific mind and magical heritage are not opposing forces. They are two hands working together to protect what matters most." Spring arrived in Cheviot Hills, bringing with it a transformation more profound than the mere change of seasons. The forest had evolved into something extraordinary, a perfect fusion of natural wonder and ancient power. Jakub stood at the edge of the stone circle, watching the morning mist swirl with visible threads of energy, reflecting on how far he'd come from the skeptical scientist who'd first arrived months ago. The cubs had grown remarkably, their supernatural heritage evident in their shifting grey coats and wise eyes. They moved through the forest with increasing confidence, already learning their role as future guardians. Their mother, fully recovered from her earlier ordeal, had become a powerful presence in her own right, working alongside the guardian to maintain the forest's expanded protective barriers. "Your research is causing quite a stir in the scientific community," Zofia commented, joining him at the circle. "Though I doubt they fully understand what they're reading." She smiled, knowing that Jakub's published papers contained carefully coded information, appear as groundbreaking ecological research to most readers, while revealing deeper truths to those with the ability to see them. The pendant at his chest hummed with gentle energy, no longer needed as a tool but worn as a symbol of his dual heritage. His own powers had grown to the point where he could sense the forest's needs instinctively, his scientific knowledge working in harmony with ancient wisdom to solve new challenges as they arose. The hunter's technology helped us in an unexpected way, Jakub reflected, reviewing data on his tablet that showed the forest's strengthened energy patterns. Their attempt to suppress the forest's power forced us to develop better protections, ones that can't be disrupted by modern interference. The guardian appeared beside them, its form more solid in the morning light. Through their bond, Jakub received images of other forests around the world, other sacred places in need of similar protection. His grandmother's journals had mentioned a network of guardians, each protecting their own territories while sharing knowledge across generations. Now he understood that he was part of something far larger, a global effort to preserve not just the natural world, but the ancient magic that gave it life. Using his unique perspective, Jakub had created a new classification system for the forest's phenomena, one that bridged scientific taxonomy with magical understanding. Each species, each energy pattern, each natural process was documented in ways that honored both its physical and supernatural aspects. This work would become the foundation for a new generation of guardian scientists, those who could see the full spectrum of nature's wonder. The cubs played near the stone circle, their energy interacting with the ancient stones in ways that created beautiful patterns of light. They represented hope, proof that the old ways could adapt and thrive in the modern world. Their existence challenged the artificial boundary between natural and supernatural, showing how seamlessly the two could coexist. Zofia watched them with knowing eyes. "Your grandmother saw this future, you know. She knew the forest would need someone who could speak both languages, the language of science and the language of magic. That's why she made sure you received both forms of education, even if you didn't realize it at the time." The forest hummed with activity as morning fully arrived, its enhanced vitality evident in every blooming flower and singing bird. The rare species Jakub had initially come to study were thriving, protected by both natural and supernatural means. New plants had appeared, bearing the subtle marks of magical influence while following established evolutionary patterns, proof that nature itself had never recognized the artificial division between science and magic. Standing there, surrounded by the legacy of countless guardians before him and the promise of those yet to come, Jakub felt a deep sense of purpose. His journey had not been about choosing between science and magic, but about understanding how they completed each other. The forest had taught him that the greatest mysteries often lay not in choosing one truth over another, but in seeing how multiple truths could coexist and strengthen each other. As the sun rose higher, casting sacred geometries through the ancient trees, Jakub began his daily rounds. His tablet recorded empirical data, while his enhanced senses monitored magical energies, both sets of information equally valuable in maintaining the forest's balance. The guardian walked beside him, no longer a mysterious figure, but a partner in protection, both of them serving as bridges between worlds that had only appeared separate. The story of Cheviot Hills would continue, carrying forward through generations of guardians yet to come. But its future now held new promise, a future where ancient wisdom and modern knowledge worked together, where science and magic strengthened each other, and where the treasures of the natural world were protected by those who could see and understand their full magnificence. Dear readers, we hope this tale of transformation and discovery has touched your hearts. The story of Jakub's journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest mysteries lie not in choosing between different ways of understanding the world, but in finding how they can work together. If you'd like to explore more stories that bridge the gap between science and magic, between the measurable and the mystical, please subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We have many more amazing stories waiting to be told, each one exploring the wonderful complexity of our world. Join us on this continuing journey of discovery.